Okay, all. So this week we're going to be discussing the Atlantic trade system, the Atlantic system. Now, often this system is sometimes um, reduced to what might be called the triangular trade. Now, that's not wrong. It's just not entirely right because it's a system, and it's not just the triangular trade, and it's not just trade happening in those sort of three geographic areas, right? The triangular trade, I think, is often most associated with things like trade going from Europe, particularly England and Western Europe, down to Africa, Africa across to the Americas, and then the Americas back to Europe. Now, that's not wrong. However, that's just sort of minimalized. And there's a whole larger aspect to that we must begin to be aware of. So, what is driving this triangular trade or this Atlantic system comes most from the idea of this plantation complex. And this plantation complex really is what's driving it. Now, where are these plantations located? Predominantly, they're located obviously in the Americas, both North and South America, where most of the plantations actually sort of against maybe United States or American supposition is that it's actually they're located mostly in South America, particularly in places like Brazil, that become huge sugar plantations, huge sugar exporters. Now, this transforms the international trade system because you're looking for huge amounts of animals, huge amounts of goods to go to these plantations in the New World, North and South America, but also there's huge extraction, right? There's many agricultural products that are being sent from the New World to the Old, but also from the Old to the New. And we looked at that a little bit when we looked at the Columbian Exchange a couple of weeks ago. Sugar really becomes a major product here. Sugar is extraordinarily in demand. People love the way it tastes, but it's also becomes a huge business for the slaves, where there's slaves who are being brought to the New World to grow sugar, and their entire lives are dominated by this product. Now, there are a few myths about slaves. No, that's not going to work. About slaves, right? Slaves were often most impacted by this, obviously, because they were ripped from their homelands and they were sent across the Atlantic to foreign lands that they had never experienced before. However, there was a huge resistance to this, and there was an attempt to try and keep much of their identity when they arrived in the New World. There are huge mortality rates, particularly once aboard the boats. Basically, if you think about one person being sick, very quickly that disease or that illness would spread within days, and you're talking maybe a month-long to 2-month-long journey across the Atlantic Ocean where many people are going to die. What we have, though, is many pieces of culture coming with Africans to the New World, and many of it's retained by these slaves once they arrive. Voodoo culture and often is part of that. We call this idea synergism. Synergism is the idea that you blend cultures. We will talk a little bit before the end of today's lecture about how slaves are forced to learn Christianity, and they blend Christian ideas along with their traditional, maybe African cultures. Let's talk a little bit about the slave labor in sugar, and then I'll talk about sort of how slaves were taken. African slaves were used to grow sugar predominantly, like I said before, in South America, places like Brazil, Guyana, in what would become the Dominican Republic and Haiti, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean. And sugar was extraordinarily lucrative. Sugar was planted by the slaves, weeded by the slaves, harvested by the slaves, and was grown and processed year-round. In order to make sugar, sugar is extraordinarily dangerous to produce. When the sugar is produced, many of you know that it grows in stalks, right? It grows in big stalks. Now, in order to get the sugar out of the stalk, there needs to be an extraordinarily dangerous process that occurs. First, you must obviously cut the stalks. Now, once this happens, the process needs to happen very quickly because sugar can spoil within days, within hours, really. So once the cane is cut, then it's full on. You have to boil the raw cane in giant vats, and this begins to loosen up the syrup and makes it able to be pressed out. So then it's pushed through these gigantic rollers, and if you've ever sort of touched anything with like warm sugar on it, it becomes very slippery, very slidey. So then once you have these gigantic canes that you are pushing through this press with molten syrup on it, things become very slippery. People's hands often get caught in rollers. It becomes extraordinarily dangerous. And that's just that part. Then you have this, it has to be boiled out in these gigantic kettles, and these kettles then can sometimes explode, sending molten syrup all over the place. Extraordinarily dangerous, extraordinarily brutal. That's just the process. That's not even talking about where it takes place, right? We're talking about sugar production happening in the Caribbean or in the tropics. So extraordinarily hot, disease-ridden mosquitoes. We're talking awful, awful living situations for these slaves. The lifespan of a slave during this period would sometimes be about mid-20s, so not very old at all because of this awful conditions. So let's talk about how these slaves wound up coming to the Caribbean, how they wound up being moved over. This largely happens because of the triangular trade system, the Atlantic system. So, let's talk about this trade. So products are going, and actually it might be easier if I pull up a map here, so if you'll pardon me for a second. Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. So this is the slide that I was looking for. So if you see here, this is the triangular trade that I'm sure many of you have learned before. And I apologize that this is blurry when I made the map bigger. It distorted it a little bit. But let's start up here in England, right? As the trade is coming from Western Europe and moving down into Africa, the goods that are leaving here, as it says here, are textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa. The textiles and rum are fine. Everybody needs clothes. Everybody likes a little booze. But what we are really talking about here is the manufactured goods. In particular, we're talking about guns. Guns is extraordinarily important to remember because Europe is producing guns for themselves, but also now producing them for Africa. And when they are moving down into Africa, they are being traded for, as it says here, slaves. Human cargo is being sold, right? So why are these guns so important? Well, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Africa. Within Africa, during the 1500s, 1600s, there are tribes that are warring with one another. And this is where this warring becomes important, because the warring then produces prisoners. These prisoners then can be sold to European traders, the Portuguese and the Dutch, who then trade them into the Americas. So, guns are coming from Europe down to Africa. Guns in Africa are going to tribes. Tribe A and B fights, B loses, A takes those prisoners and trades those to the Portuguese and the Dutch. In return for these slaves, the Portuguese and the Dutch return to the African tribes, gives them guns. These guns then help Tribe A beat Tribe C. Tribe C's prisoners go to Tribe A. Tribe A gets more guns from the Portuguese and the Dutch. Now they can beat Tribe D. Do you see what's happening here? The goal is get guns. Guns help you win battles. Battles get you slaves. Slaves get you more guns. Guns get you more prisoners. Prisoners turn into slaves. and so on and so on and so on. So what we can see here is that these guns are helping to continue this system. And then the slaves are moving into the Americas, and then from the Americas, where the slaves are producing agricultural goods, cotton, sugar, tobacco, and then these products of sugar, tobacco, and cotton are going back to Europe. So we have this cyclical aspect, this systemic aspect. As I said before, these mortality rates are so high for slaves in the New World that you're having extensive amounts of slaves being brought. Millions of slaves are being extracted from Africa and sent to the New World. This is disrupting families. This is disrupting communities, tribes, and it's wiping out whole areas. It's becoming an awful situation. As my point here makes note, right? By the 1600s, in Barbados, there was a fresh batch of slaves every year just to keep the level of population high enough to work. Tobacco is one of those great products that is developed is indigenous to the New World, indigenous to North America, and really helps to bring about greater connection between North America and Europe, or even the Americas and Europe, right? Tobacco is great because tobacco is addicting. It's a great product, right? I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but if you're going to sell anything, selling things that people are addicted to, generally the best products to sell. So in Virginia and South Carolina, the growth of tobacco helps to spur this larger connection between Europe and North America. However, because of the slightly less intensive process that goes into tobacco rather than sugar, in North America generally slaves have a better fertility rate, meaning at least unlike in South America where there needs to be a new batch of slaves just to keep the population level, in North America there is a slight positive growth rate, meaning that slaves are actually producing children that are living into adulthood. Now again, that's a slight, we're talking maybe 1% or 2% growth rate, but it is significant to note that it is different from South America. That in no way, though, is saying that this is a better system. People are still being disrupted. Their families are still being upset. So this is not in any way, shape, or form saying that it's a better system. So that's the impact that it has on African slaves. Let's talk briefly about the impact that this has on slaves that are here, and then also on Europeans. The slaves that are in the New World are often treated very, very poorly, almost always treated very poorly. They are what is called chattel slaves, meaning that they can be moved whenever their marriages are not recognized, legally at least. Maybe a master might accept a marriage, but that's not guaranteed. And they can be moved at the drop of a hat whenever they're sold. For Europeans here in the New World, there is a big difference, particularly when we talk about two aspects: indentured servitude and the desire to become a master, right? So why do we rely on slaves in the New World? We rely on slaves because indentured servitude became too expensive. So indentured servitude is where a master might pay the ticket for a white European to come over to the New World. This white European would work for generally 5 to 7 years and then would be free. However, this becomes very expensive. Every 7 years you need to buy a new person. Additionally, you need to treat this person very well. So we need there's a level of expectation that Europeans are expecting so that they have to be treated well. And that's not necessarily consistent with sugar and tobacco production. You also have this new sort of approach to types of jobs that people have to have. Colonies are meant to make money for the homeland. And because they must make money, certain jobs must be done. Cropping, building, and selling of goods must happen. So Europeans are forced to work certain jobs because of that. And I hope that that this is helpful in answering the questions for this week. Take care.